All right, guys. So what's up? Got this video to pop up in my feed, and it's pretty relevant to some things I've been talking about. And I went a couple minutes into it and realized at that point that I want to react to it because he already said some things that that I could definitely add some things to, and some things that maybe I didn't quite agree with. I think I agree with what this guy's saying overall. I think he's saying that animal protein's better. But I heard him not saying a lot of things, and I heard him leaving out a lot of stuff that's very important. But anyways, let's just hear what he's got to say.
All right, welcome back to another episode of the Always Adaptive Podcast. I'm your host, Randall James. I am a strength and a running coach, and today's topic, I'm answering the question, is animal protein superior to plant protein? Now, the reason why I wanted to touch on this, as I know, the topic has been beaten to death. There are tons of other content creators that have talked about this, but Brad Schoenfeld and colleagues just released another meta-analysis on this topic where they looked at randomized control.
Brad Schoenfeld, not sure how I feel about him. He's, as far as I know, he's a guy doing all sorts of 12 and 6-week hypertrophy studies and stuff like that. Not sure, but I guess we'll see what he's talking about.
Trials comparing animal to plant-based protein. And so to me, if there are still people discussing this, then I want to discuss it because it's a topic that I'm really interested in. Now, before we dig into this, I just want to express my bias that I am a strength and a running coach. So muscle mass and performance are very important to me. And the reason why I say that is one of the things that the plant-based crowd will say in defense of plant-based protein is that, well, the amount of protein that you're supposed to be intaking in the first place is excessive. You know, people say 1 gram per pound of lean body mass, or there are other people that say one gram.
Yeah, so I guess he's saying that, some of these plant-based guys are saying that the numbers are too high, that the 1 gram per pound of body weight is too much. Who says, bro? Maybe for you, maybe you don't need that much, okay? But maybe my body is denser than yours. Maybe I'm made out of more protein. I mean, after all, every single cell in your body is, the very structure of it is held together by protein. Your whole body is. So this guy here, he's saying, for gaining muscle, but muscle's not the only thing you need protein for. Your whole body, every single cell in your body is made out of protein.
Per pound of body weight in general, and some of the people from the plant-based crowd will say that that's excessive, and I completely disagree. I think we are better off being on the high end of things and trying to build as much muscle as possible, within reason, of course, not being like a roided out, person that's 70, 80
completely
pounds
agree,
overweight.
but not just for building muscle.
Having more muscle leads to all kinds of benefits outside of performance. You get better glycemic control, so your muscles are filled with muscle glycogen, 1 gram of glucose to about 3 to 4 grams of water. So the more muscle you have this really nice glucose disposal system, or not really disposal, but storage system, you could say, and that leads to a reduction in type 2 diabetes and all kinds of other chronic diseases. So that's really important.
No, that's wrong. That's wrong what he said. That's one thing I picked up on when I first watched it that I wanted to point out. That's wrong right there, what he just said. He said that because your muscles store glycogen, he corrected himself. He said, oh, no, it's not because of glycogen disposal. It's because the storage, and he said that helps with type 2 diabetes. That's incorrect. That's not true. Actually, the effect from muscle mass that you get from a good effect of it is the fact that it burns glycogen, and it gets rid of the sugar in your diet. No, the storage of glycogen, you still have the same problem of the insulin and the feedback with the blood sugar, and the whole thing. That problem is never solved. You either turn it into body fat, you either burn it off as energy, which, yes, having more lean muscle is beneficial for that purpose. But activity is as well if you're eating mass amounts of sugar and glycogen. But of course, the best antidote to combating high levels of blood glucose is just to not eat glucose. I mean, if you store the glucose in your muscles, it's going to have to be released anyway. Not to mention the fact that insulin is going to have to store it as well. So that's actually incorrect what he said. He has the right idea, but it's actually incorrect.
Now, what is my stance? You're probably thinking, if you're a vegan or a vegetarian, that, well, Randall, I've seen this athlete, or I've seen this UFC fighter, or this bodybuilder, they're vegan, vegetarian, and they look great. And yes, those people do exist. There are people that have amazing success on these types of diets, but that is anecdote, and exceptions don't disprove the rule. My stance also isn't that you cannot, that plant.
Yeah, what about all the anecdotes of of the people's hair falling out, and the fact that girls lose their periods, and the fact that you actually eventually die if you eat solely plant-based? That is a fact. You will become nutrient deficient, and you will eventually die if you don't at least take supplements on your vegan diet. I mean, that's a scientific fact. People would debate like, oh no, it's possible. You can eat pure vegan diet and not take supplements. It's like, well, is it possible? Maybe it's possible, but you would literally have to be eating all day, and you would have to be eating all raw whole foods all day. I mean, it would be completely infeasible, even in the hypothetical maybe that it's possible. And what you're doing, if you're a vegan out there, what you're doing, eating pasta and then taking your multivitamins, that's not it. If you're doing it for ethical reasons, that's one thing, but for health, it's just a no off the bat.
Protein is completely worthless. My stance is animal protein is a bit superior to plant protein, and you can still build.
Yeah, I would definitely say absolutely. There's no denying that. If you saw my last video about protein content and stuff, we didn't even get into all that, but the bioavailability, he mentions that. Bioavailability of meat protein is completely different. But what I haven't heard him mention yet is the fact of all the other things that are in meat. Like, are we going to talk about that? All the micronutrients, the source matters. I mean, everything else in the food, the fact that meat is the most nutritionally dense food on the planet. Are we not going to mention that? We're not going to mention all the lacking nutrients in the plant foods and all that. But let's hear what else he has to say.
A great physique and live a strong life on plant protein, but it requires proper planning. You can't just all willy-nilly eat whatever plants you want and not really think about protein sources and get adequate protein intake. And we're going to get into why. There are three reasons,
absolutely.
And these are in no particular order, but you have amino acid profile, you have the bioavailability of the protein, and you also have macronutrient breakdown. I'm also going to get into study design at the end of all this, so if that topic really interests you, feel free to skip around. I'll have the chapters marked in the video and both in the audio form as well.
That's cool.
But let's get into it. So we're going to start off talking about amino acid profile. You may have heard that animal proteins are complete proteins, whereas plant proteins are incomplete proteins. Now, that's a general statement. There are plant proteins that are complete, like quinoa is a really popular one, but proteins are made up of...
That is actually debated. Whether that's completely true, especially with the bioavailability thing. Now, I will say I have not looked into that research enough to give my opinion on that. Personally, just from my experience, I will say I have had supposed whole, proteins from plants, such as like pea proteins and stuff like this. People say those are whole proteins. Just from my own anecdotal experience, not looking at the research myself, I can tell you, man, it's not the same. It's just not. You eat 20 grams of pea protein and 20 grams of real protein. The differences are massive. I can literally see the difference in the mirror. I can feel the difference in the gym in terms of how fast I recover from, let's say, a damaging workout. Completely different. But that is something I need to look at the research more. But that is a debated topic.
Amino acids. There are 20 different types that our body needs, and 9 of these are essential, and we cannot produce these 9. They must be obtained through diet. These are histidine, isoleucine, leucine.
But one thing I do want to mention is that even if these plant proteins are technically whole, that just means that there is a minute amount of all these essential amino acids. That does not at all take into account the distribution of the amount. So if there's 0.001 milligrams of one of the essential amino acids, it's like, well, technically that's complete. but are you actually getting any benefit, any usable amount? No.
Lysine, methionine, phenylalanine, threonine, tryptophan, and valine. Now, the big one on this list is leucine. Leucine is primarily responsible for muscle protein synthesis. There are plant sources that do have a decent amount of leucine, but again, this goes back to my point that you have to plant and you have to find them, whereas most animal sources are going to have a decent amount of leucine to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. Leucine has the strongest activation of mTOR, which is mechanistic target of rapamycin, and it's like the central regulator of cell growth and protein synthesis and all that stuff.
Yeah, he's talking about mTOR. You know, that's one single pathway. Gets completely overplayed. People talking about mTOR. That's not even, you know, there's a million other pathways, and that's not even how muscles really built in the end. I mean, there's so many other things that need to happen. But anyway.
Leucine threshold per meal is about 2 to 3 grams, and without it, muscle protein synthesis will not be stimulated. Now, let's look at this graph. I have the top 5 are animal sources of protein, and the bottom 5 are plant sources of protein. Now, this is per serving, not per 100 grams. A lot of people like to do per 100 grams, and that's just completely asinine way of looking at it, because you're not going to eat 100 grams of hemp seeds in one serving.
Exactly.
Now, chicken breast, you can see, has over 4 grams of leucine. Eggs has a modest 0.5, but you have to keep into account that when people eat eggs, they're not just eating one single egg. For example, when I'm eating eggs, I'll have 2 whole eggs and I'll mix it with 5 servings of egg whites. So the leucine content of that is going to be much greater than what's on this graph. Salmon, a modest 2.5, beef over 4, pork over 2, and then you look at the plant sources and it's pretty low. Lentils is over 1.
Exactly. That's what I was talking about. I mean, it's astronomical. I mean, look at that.
Not enough to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. Pumpkin seeds under 1. Quinoa, hemp seeds, almonds, all of these are under 1. Now, there are other foods, other ways of getting leucine, mainly protein shakes. So notice I didn't include.
Protein shakes are not real. You get 30 grams from a protein shake, even if it's whey protein. It is not at all the same as 30 grams from meat.
Whey protein or soy protein isolate on here, and that's by design. This is to drive home the point that without shakes, you're not going to get enough leucine to stimulate muscle protein synthesis, whereas with animal protein, that's not the case. Any of these that you pick from, you're going to get enough leucine. Now, I want to touch on this planning point again, because you have the leucine side of things, but you also had the total protein side of things, where in order to get enough total protein, it's not as though you're just getting protein. Whereas if you're eating animal protein, the protein that comes along for that, yes, there's going to be some fat included in it, but it's not going to be so much fat that it's going to completely throw off the amount of calories you're eating. That's not the case with plant protein, unless, again, you're using some sort of plant protein.
Why is fat a bad thing? Why is that a bad thing? Fat has all the fat-soluble vitamins in it.
Isolate or plant.
You need fat for energy.
Protein mix shake. There's wheat and pea protein and pumpkin protein.
Has anyone ever got fat from eating a juicy steak? Has that ever happened? Or is it your cheesecake and cake that's made from ground up plants that's making you fat?
All these different proteins, those are really useful, but I mean, do you want your entire nutrition to be coming from a liquid? Because that's not going to be good. Now, a common food that's touted as being high in protein, I've heard this time and time again. I'll ask a client, how's your protein intake? And they'll say, yeah, my protein intake's pretty high. And they'll say, last night I had beans. Or,
oh yeah, people have no idea. When you hear people talk about it, I mean, the layperson just has no idea, about protein at all. They drink a protein shake and they think they're good for the day. And then they'll go just and eat pizza all day. And, I had my protein shake. And they just have no idea, really.
I'm sure you're even aware of peanut butter. Some people might be thinking peanut butter. First of all, peanut butter is not a good source of protein. It's a good source of fat. There's 3 to 4 times the amount of fat in peanut butter as there is protein. Now, if we take beans, let's break down the macronutrient profile of beans. Beans have 15 grams of protein, 1 gram of fat, and 45 grams of carbs. Now, something to notice right out of the gate, there are 3 times as many carbohydrates in beans as there is protein, meaning it's a good source of carbohydrate, not a good source of protein. The other thing to take into account that beans are not a complete protein. They do not have all 9 essential amino acids. So usually people pair beans with rice. So let's take a look at rice. For rice, we have 7 grams of protein, less than...
Personally, actually, if I were to eat one plant food for protein, it would actually be beans. That's just me personally, though.
1 gram of fat and 34 grams of carbohydrates. So again, 4 or 5 times as much carbohydrates as protein. People will pair these up in order to meet the complete amino acid profile. And in this combination, we end up with 22 grams of protein, which is pretty good, around 1.5 grams of fat, and 79 grams of carbohydrates. Now, if you've been following me for any amount of time,
That's
you know I'm not
carbs,
against carbohydrates whatsoever, especially if someone is like a high performer, if they run a lot or if they lift weights a lot, particularly bodybuilding style weight training programs. Now,
yeah, because they're trying to load a bunch of glycogen in a muscle to make fake muscles and draw the water in there and make sarcoplasmic growth.
The place where people do have to be mindful is if they're sedentary. So if you have someone that switches over to a vegan, vegetarian diet and they're just sitting around, they don't weight train, they don't run, they don't do anything, carbohydrates are going to be a problem. They're spiking their blood glucose consistently. They're not emptying their muscle glycogen stores. So in a lot of ways, that's a really fast track towards type 2 diabetes. Now, let's look at a piece of meat, a typical 6-ounce chicken breast, because chicken breasts are pretty big. You get 46 grams of protein, 5 grams of fat, and
6 ounces of chicken breast is not a lot of chicken breast, dude. I mean, the average person would think that's a lot of meat. That is not a lot. I mean, I could eat a 6-ounce steak like nothing.
Grams of carbohydrate. So are you starting to get the picture here? Animal protein doesn't take much planning. It's protein. You know what you're going to get. It's going to have enough leucine to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. Going to have enough protein
with all
to
the
contribute to your total
and
daily
peptides
protein without you having to worry about other macronutrients increasing the caloric profile of the food. And just to drive that point home, I want to show you another graph that's looking at specifically macronutrients and not just leucine content. So you'll notice the yellow bars are the amount of protein, the orange bars are fat, and the red bars are carbohydrate. Now, the bottom 5 this time are animal sources of protein. Now, you can see that the yellow line on the bottom 5 is absolutely massive, meaning that these foods are mostly protein as opposed to the...
And look, this guy, I don't know what his overall message is here, but all he's talking about is protein, and he's got chicken breast as the leader here. Chicken breast is like one of the worst meats you can eat. It's super high in protein, yes, but that's only because it has nothing else in it. It has no fat. It has very low vitamins and minerals in it. It's just deficient, really. Yeah, it's got a lot of protein, and that's why it's so high on this chart here. But I mean, actually, beef is literally, what is this? Macronutrient content of beef. Beef obviously has way more fat, and this chart doesn't say here, but beef has way more micronutrients in it, whereas chicken breast is, deficient. But so we're just focusing on protein here, when we're completely lacking everything else that's gonna, enable all those signaling pathways in your body, such as mTOR that was previously mentioned, to actually be able to be turned on and functional.
Top 5, where the yellow line is pretty small, except for lentils. Lentils have a decent amount of protein, but they have twice as many carbohydrates if you look at the red line. Now let's talk about the bioavailability point. Bioavailability is if you're eating 2 different sources of protein, which one are you actually absorbing? And the idea here is that animal protein is much more bioavailable, meaning you are actually absorbing the stuff that you're intaking, whereas a lot of the protein in plant sources of protein, especially stuff like nuts and seeds, is bound up in the fibrous plant material, and that's just going to end up in your stools. Yes, you're going to get some of it.
There's also things called anti-nutrients that actually block the absorption of these things. A lot of things in plants they're anti-nutrients. It's exactly what it sounds like. They block the absorption of these nutrients through your stomach and through your small intestines, and just don't allow your body to even absorb them.
But you're not going to get most of it like you would from animal protein. Now, there are 2 different ways of testing for this. They have the PDCAAS, which is the Protein Digestibility Corrected Amino Acid Score. And then they also have the DIAAS, which is the
Created by WHO and some other agency. Don't know much. I agree with that. They're telling me I need to eat plant proteins. So automatically I'm not too sure about that. But let's see.
indispensable amino acid score from 2013. That's the more recent and the more accurate way. Now, the big reason why they switched over from the PDC AAS is, as I'm going to show you in a moment, the scores are all capped at 1, meaning 1 is 100%. So if there's a particular food that had a higher effect, it doesn't show it here. It just stops it right at 1. So you'll see milk
Yeah, I bet beef was too high. Beef was over 100%. They're like, we can't have that.
protein, whey protein, eggs, and soy protein isolate, which I mentioned before, that if you're using a shake, that's going to be really beneficial for a plant-based diet. They're all capped at 1, when in reality, some of these could be a little bit higher. Now, they switched over to the DIAAS because they wanted to stop capping it at 1 so they could see even greater differences. But also, they're not just testing the fecal matter, they're also testing the small intestine. So they'll take samples from just before the ileum, the ending portion of the small intestine, and they'll see what's going on in there. What is that sample made up of? The results of the rankings is, again, milk protein concentrate, eggs, whey protein. These are all above 1, chicken breast above 1.
Milk protein concentrate. Like, do you really think that milk protein concentrate is the most absorbable form of protein you can get? Like, does that even make sense to you intuitively?
Soy and almonds at the lowest. Like I was saying, nuts and seeds are going to have a really hard time absorbing the protein from that, because you have soluble and insoluble fiber, and insoluble fiber is going to make it through you. Your body's going to have a hard time breaking that down. So this kind of just drives my point home that regardless of a plant source of protein having enough protein, either enough leucine or enough total protein in general, your body's still not going to absorb it. And just to support that, I want to talk about a really quick study. This is entitled Differential Responses of Blood Essential Amino Acid Levels Following Ingestion of High...
It's compared to whey protein. Why is it compared to whey protein? Why is whey protein the gold standard? Why? Whey protein is a supplement. It's not a food.
All of animal protein have whey protein, a double-blind, randomized, crossover clinical trial. Now, this is a really good example of animal protein having a higher biological value. This study...
Again, animal protein this, animal protein that. Whey protein is basically a synthesized ingredient, okay, that's been extracted and isolated from milk, okay, which milk is a whole food, yes. Whey protein is not a whole food. It is designed to be void of all the nutrients that come with your food source. And, those are freaking important, man. So I don't know why we're just focusing on protein. I really don't understand.
Leucine is primarily 3 different plant protein blends to whey protein isolate as the control group. And what was really interesting about this is that they matched total leucine content. So earlier in the podcast, I was talking about how leucine is primarily responsible for muscle protein synthesis. And without a certain threshold, you won't stimulate that. And you can see that they hit that number with 2.6 grams of leucine. But inadvertently, by doing that, they also increased the total amount of protein for all 3 plant sources. You could see that 1 through 3, they have 34 grams of protein total, whereas the control group, the whey protein isolate group, only has 24 grams of protein. Now, protein blend 1 is pea and pumpkin, blend 2 is pea, pumpkin, and sunflower and coconut, and blend 3 is pea and pumpkin. The reason why they're combining is going back to the amino acid point that I made earlier, where animal protein is a complete protein, whereas plant protein sources are not, and you have to pair them up in order to make a complete amino acid profile. So with them doing their best to give plant protein a really fair shot, you would expect that the results would be pretty similar between the two. Now, they were, but there's also something really interesting that happened. I'm going to put up this graph, and you can see that the line that has the upside down triangles on it, that is the control group. That is the whey protein isolate group. And you can see the area under the...
I mean, frick, man, what is this even testing? I mean, they're trying to be like these uber scientists and like figure out like, oh, is plant protein better than this? But they're completely ignoring the practicality of the situation, which is that meat has just exponentially more nutrients in it. Nutrients, broski, nutrients, all right? And they're looking at these supplements, all right, which are protein isolates from plants, peas and pumpkins in this case, and then whey, which like, what are you studying here? What are you actually looking at? You know that if your body doesn't have these nutrients, these vitamins and minerals and other compounds, it's not going to be able to turn on these pathways, and it's not going to be able to synthesize the protein. It's not just protein that you need. It's nutrition.
Curve is much higher for that group. Now, what is that? The left side is blood amino acids, and the bottom side is the amount of time that has passed. So they go from fasting to 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 120 minutes. Now, they all follow the same pattern, but you can see at 15 minutes, whey protein has already surpassed the plant protein blends by a large margin, and it stays elevated for a much longer time. So this speaks volumes to the fact that not all protein is created equal.
I mean, can you believe that? They've completely isolated these proteins, and still animal protein is outperforming it. I mean, that is absolutely incredible. Just
when they try to give plant protein a fair shot, it just does not work out in their favor. Now, one last topic I want to get into is a little bit of study design and answering the question, is animal protein safe? There are those out there that are plant-based protein advocates that would say, well...
Before he even says anything, why would it not be? Why would animal protein not be? We are designed to eat animal products. I mean, like, what even question is that?
Animal protein or red meat or just meat in general can cause cancer or
Not true. There's absolutely no evidence to back that up.
Increases your risk of high blood pressure, all these different things.
Not true. There's epidemiological studies.
It's important to note that the studies that most of these people use to make these claims are observational in nature, and they can never infer causation. The reason for that, there's a difference between an observational study and intervention study. An intervention study, they're providing nutritional guidelines, or they may even provide them food, depending on how granular they get. Whereas an observational study, they're relying on food frequency questionnaires, and a lot of this data is already compiled. For example, we have...
So then you get those healthy user biased, where you get people who are vegans who are trying to be healthy because they've been convinced that eating plants is healthy. And so they avoid other things such as, I don't know, eating chemicals, and they don't eat as much pizza, and maybe they actually focus on eating more whole foods. And wouldn't you know it, the guy eating cheeseburgers from McDonald's, while he may even still be getting more vitamins and minerals from the meat, even though he's eating store-bought meat that's been grain-fed, that itself is devoid of nutrients and is nothing like actual grass-fed meat. Even still, he might still be getting more vitamins from that. I mean, I don't know, right? But then he's getting all these plant seed oils and all these refined carbohydrates and stuff in his diet. And then, he has atherosclerosis, and then he has a heart blockage, and he dies from cardiovascular disease. And then, they say it was the meat that did it, not the ounces and liters of plant seed oils that he eats every single week.
The Nurses Health Study and Health Professionals Follow-Up Study, these relied on food frequency questionnaires every 2 to 4 years, asking participants to recall their diet over the past year. We also have the
Dudesky, all right, so I am actually a certified personal trainer. Wouldn't you know it? Ain't that freaking classy? Ain't I special for that one? No, if you don't know, that's like super easy to get. You pay for a certification. But anyway, I've been into the gym for a while. And what does that mean? I've watched a lot of YouTube videos from people who have trained a lot of people and stuff like this. All right. And what did I learn? And what did they talk about, in the course for personal training that I actually took? They tell you that people are absolutely terrible at recalling what they eat. That is like one of the biggest things that when you go to a personal training certificate course, they try to beat into you, is that people are absolutely not at all good at recounting to you what they eat. Even on the day, if you ask somebody at the end of the day what they ate that day, It's completely wrong, completely wrong. And if you actually somehow, observe them and watch what they eat, it's going to be completely different from what they say. So if you ask somebody what they've eaten over the course of a year, I mean, you might as well be asking them, how many stars are in the sky. I mean, it's completely, not trustworthy at all.
Health study where the FFQs were administered every few years, assessing dietary intake over the past year. Now, I just had a conversation with Physionic about that, or I asked him a question and he made me a nice video. He's kind enough to make me a long video on the topic. And one thing he noted is that epidemiology today is much better than it used to be. So while, yes, we can poo-poo on this type of...
How can you get around that fact? People don't change. People aren't any better at assessing what they've eaten over the course of a week or a month or a year. How could that be?
They are getting better, and they're starting to use 24-hour recall surveys, which is a little bit better.
That's a little bit better.
But it's still not good enough. Now, the other issue with these studies is because they're not controlling what these people...
Because people don't even know what they eat. Even if they remember that they cooked, this certain food, or they went out to this certain restaurant to eat, they can't tell you what was in that food. They don't know. If they go to a restaurant, they have no idea. They'll tell you, oh, I ate a steak and I ate some potatoes. But they forget to tell you all the seed oils that were put on the steak, that the steak was cooked in, and they forget to tell you all the seed oils that were in the mashed potatoes. And even if they cook the food, they forget to tell you about the PAM that they sprayed on the pan, because the can says 0 calories, but they sprayed it for 10 seconds straight, and they didn't realize that they actually got 100 calories worth of seed oil sprayed onto the pan. Building this picture, you see, it's completely untrustworthy. And this is the fault of epidemiological studies.
People are eating. When they try to think about what they're going to define as meat, there's a difference between processed meat and like lean whole food sources of meat. If someone's eating Spam, for example, or they're frying bacon all the time, there's going to be a much larger difference in their outcomes versus someone that's eating lean chicken or lean ground beef. Like me, for example, I always eat either 96.4 or 97.3 if I can find it. So the quality of meat is going to dramatically...
Brother, if that's store-bought meat and that's not grass-fed meat, I hate to inform you, but you might be happy to be informed that it's probably got about 5 times less nutrients on average than if you were to eat real grass-fed meat. That's a true fact. Look it up.
Affect the outcomes, and most of these studies don't control for this. For example, this study, worse inflammatory profile in omnivores than in vegetarians, associates with the gut microbiota composition. Participants were considered strict vegetarians when consuming no animal products, but they were considered omnivores if they eat animal products, red meat, poultry, fish, eggs, milk, and dairy products more than once a month. Well, what does that mean, animal products? How are you going to...
Again, epidemiological. They're conflating vegetarians who are health conscious already, even if they've been misled and they're following faulty research. At least on average, everyone knows that whole foods are better than processed foods. So these vegetarians on average, because they're self-proclaimed vegetarians, are probably eating whole foods. And they're not eating things like plant seed oils and refined carbohydrates. So I would expect that even a vegetarian or a vegan who's also taking supplements, on average, will be healthier than the average American who's just eating processed foods. So study means nothing.
By that, like, again, Spam is an animal product, bacon is an animal product, fried chicken, fast food, burgers, barbecue, fatty ribs, all this stuff. The list goes on. So if you're not providing strict nutrition guidelines for these people, or you're not providing them with the food, and you're not providing them with education on the topic, then you really you can't even rely on this type.
Absolutely, man. Side note, this video is going real long, but if you're here, I'll tell you. Man, I'm in college right now, right? And I'm taking biology courses, and they're telling me they've got like one chapter on nutrition, right? And man, it is just absolutely so deficient in what they're saying. And the advice that they're giving to people, they are telling people to eat plant seed oils. They're telling you that plant seed oils are better than eating a steak. And I will tell you, because I have actual knowledge in this field, right? The only backing that they have for this are these epidemiological studies. conflating saturated fat with cardiovascular disease. But if you actually read the research, it does not say that. It is correlative. It is not causative. All right. Again, epidemiological. It's not real science, man. It's not.
Of information. But this is why randomized controlled trials, in my opinion, are considered the gold standard. These would be intervention trials. In these studies, it's much easier to control for all the variables I mentioned. They get really granular with the stuff that they're measuring, and it eliminates a lot of the confounding variables that you would find in epidemiological studies or observational studies. Without the controls, studies that link meat consumption and negative health outcomes, like high blood pressure or whatever, they can be extremely misleading. And I honestly think most of them can be thrown out of the window. The other point that a lot of people bring up is, and especially the older studies, people that eat more meat, they tend to smoke cigarettes. They tend to basically do whatever they want. They drink more sodas. They have all kinds of behaviors that are not beneficial to longevity. Whereas
because people, Americans, have been psyoped by the food industry, the medical industry, the nutrition industry. I mean, I don't want to get conspiratorial or anything, but I mean, that is a fact. You know, the food pyramid and such with the FDA, things like this. We've been completely misled for years and years because the scientists have been doing fake science, not real science. They've been making mistakes. They've been not crossing their T's and they've been not crossing their I's. And it's unfortunate for us because even me, I remember as a kid around like 13 or 14 or something, I remember going through this little phase where I was like, oh, I want to be healthy, you know? And I remember blending up like all these vegetables and stuff. And I was like, oh yeah, it's healthy, right? I remember my dad and my older brother, like kind of like a little bit making fun of me. They're like, like, oh, girls' food or whatever they said, I don't want to bash on them, but, I was psyoped myself. And, looking back, like it would have been way better for me right then to just eat a real steak. I mean, scientifically, that's not an opinion piece. That is a scientific fact. It's the most nutritionally dense food on earth.
Vegan vegetarians, this is called healthy user bias. They tend to exercise. They spend more time outside. They're actually paying attention to their health a bit more. And so that immediately is going to skew the results. Is it the fact that they're eating vegetables and not eating animal protein? Or is it all of the other behaviors that they have that the animal protein group does not have? But
100%.
As time goes on, I am starting to appreciate epidemiology a little bit more. I need to do a bit more research into the topic. So I don't want it to seem as though I think it's completely worthless. I think it definitely has its place. But I think we need to stop relying on older studies like the two that I mentioned.
What it's used for is for preliminary, let's say, surveying research, preceding research before further research, to get a picture of, let's say, a groundwork or a framework of what's going on before actual real research is done. That's what it's for. But it's not real science. You can't make any conclusive conclusions from it.
In the nurse study and such. Now, what about meta-analyses? So a meta-analysis is it's a study of studies or a study of randomized controlled trials. And I do think that these are useful, but the reason why I'm hesitant on meta-analysis is scientists will make a claim, and obviously the average individual is not going to dive into the study and look at each individual study
No, they don't, because these people are trusted. Because these people, go to school and actually they have the credentials and stuff. So yeah, people put trust in them. And unfortunately, in the recent past and still up till today, that trust was misguided, unfortunately, for the American people and people worldwide.
Even look at the figures. Most people just look at the conclusion. They'll just scroll to the result and they'll just leave it at that. They don't actually take the time to click on the Department of Information link and find the actual full text and actually break it down for themselves, which I understand. I mean, obviously that takes a lot of time, so I don't expect most people to do that. However, almost every single time I look at a meta-analysis, it'll say a small result for this or a modest result for that or a negative result for that. And almost every time, I can't say every time, but almost every time, there's one or two studies that are completely skewing the graph or the chart or whatever. And a good example of this is Brad Schoenfeld's study. So I want to take a look at this real quick. So Brad Schoenfeld's
Brad getting called
preprint
out.
study is entitled Effects of Plant versus Animal-Based Proteins on Muscle Protein Synthesis, Systematic Review with Meta-Analysis. Now, I'm going to put up a forest plot from his study. You can see that the dotted line means there was no effect. The left side means favors plants. Right side means favors animals. And you can see the list of the studies on the left side and the effect on the right side. Now, first thing you'll notice right off the bat is that almost all of these studies favored animals, with the exception of a couple that weren't statistically significant. One is slightly on the plant side, but there's one study in Montaigne et al. That really is skewing this. And the reason why that's important is because they do state the average at the bottom, and you can see there's a modest effect, where the important thing to take into account here is that Montaigne et al. Was actually not using plant protein, it was using mycoprotein. And this is an important distinction because mycoprotein has a complete amino acid profile, but it's completely different than plants. Plants rely on photosynthesis to metabolize energy. Fungus, which is what mycoprotein is, actually relies on aerobic respiration.
Fungus protein, broski. You really think fungus is better food than meat? Are you kidding me?
Very similar metabolism to human beings. So it's kind of, I don't want to say unfair, but misleading that they included that study because it's not a plant at all. And I think if you remove that study from this forest plot, it would move the average at the bottom to the right by a large margin. But anytime I read a meta-analysis, people use the words like small or modest, and that's what Brad Schoenfeld kind of said in his post, where he said animal-based proteins.
Yeah, actually, fungus, actually, their protein content, as it were, actually is closer to animal protein in terms of like their cellular makeup, as a side note.
Showed a modest advantage in stimulating muscle protein synthesis compared to plant-based proteins. Though the effect estimate was small and of uncertain practical significance, this difference was more noticeable in older adults, whereas younger individuals exhibited similar muscle protein synthetic responses regardless of protein source. Now, again, using the words modest and small, there's nothing modest and small about this. I mean, yes, strictly statistically speaking, you could say that. But again, if we remove Montaigne et al., almost every single study is favoring animals. So that's, to me, that's like words you should be using, is that this study overwhelmingly favors animal protein. When you use words like modest or small, you make it seem as though it's not such a big deal. And as I kind of mentioned in the beginning of the podcast, this is a really big deal because you have, again, you're going to have people aiming for plant sources of protein. They're not taking care to use proper planning to account for the increased macronutrients that you'll get in carbohydrates with these plant sources, or even fat in plant sources like peanuts or nuts and seeds in generals. They're not accounting.
Why are micronutrients better? I mean, most people want to eat less food than more food. But if you are trying to get a macronutrient, I would try to get fat from animal products because they have so many vitamins and minerals with them. Carbohydrates, on average, you're eating carbohydrates, they don't have any micronutrients in them. And if you're eating a substantial portion of your macronutrients from a food source that lacks in micronutrients, as a direct product of that, you're going to be deficient in nutrients.
For the bioavailability, meaning they're pooping out a lot of the protein that they're even eating in the first place. They're not accounting for the leucine content. And oh, by the way, most of these studies, they're not just using whole food sources of protein. Most studies have wised up. So if you see a study, a randomized controlled trial that's comparing plant protein to animal protein, usually it's using some sort of plant protein blend, like the study I mentioned earlier, where they had the 3 plant protein blends versus the whey protein isolate. That's how most studies are now. So basically these studies they're basing the results off of someone having to...
Because they're trying to be super rigorous and take out all these confounding factors, but really they're just completely losing the actual plot.
Drink their protein all day long. Now, I just said a lot, and I also just want to reiterate the point that I'm not against plant protein. Again, all I'm saying here is that yes, you can have success on a vegan vegetarian diet. You can build a lot of muscle. You can be strong and fast and powerful, but you just have...
You could, but why is muscle the bottom line? Muscle is not the bottom line. Okay, I can eat a bunch of carbohydrates and train super high volume in the gym, and I can pump up 20 pounds of quote muscle in 2 weeks. I can do that. Okay. But why would I want to? It's not real muscle. And why would I want to be all bloated with a bunch of puffy muscles?
Plan, you have to take greater care than if you were on an animal-based diet. The other point is there are people that would say that animal products are bad for us. I would say the jury is
Not
still
true.
out on that because, again,
There's no jury being called because there's no evidence for it to be called into question.
there's a difference between a proposed theory, a mechanism, and outcomes. And we still have just not gotten that good at, not we, because I'm not a scientist, but they have just not gotten good at looking at health markers and such when it comes to looking at a plant-based diet versus an animal-based diet. And that's largely because they're still just observational in nature, using epidemiology that wasn't even really meant to look at nutrition in the first place.
All right, man. Well, that's pretty much all I got. That's my thoughts. He's got a couple more minutes. I'm not sure what else he's going to hit, but I talked about everything I wanted to talk about. Pretty good video from this guy. I hope maybe he learned something. Hope you guys learned something, but that's all I got.